Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura. And today we have a massive report to unpack that really tries to capture the full state of artificial intelligence in 2026.
I have been waiting all week to dig into this one, Chris, because Stanford's Human-Centered AI Institute just dropped their annual AI Index report. And the numbers this year are genuinely historic in ways that I think are going to surprise a lot of people listening today.
So for people who aren't familiar with the AI Index, this is basically the gold standard annual report card on where artificial intelligence stands globally, covering everything from technical benchmarks to investment to public sentiment. And Stanford has been doing this for years now.
That's exactly right. And what makes this year's edition so striking is the sheer velocity of change they're documenting, because on almost every metric, the acceleration from 2024 to 2025 was faster than any previous year-over-year shift they've ever recorded in the report's history.
Let's start with the capability side, because some of these benchmark numbers are almost hard to believe, especially if you remember where we were even just 18 months ago in terms of what these models could actually do on hard technical problems.
Okay, so here's the one that really jumped off the page for me on SWE Bench Verified, which is the benchmark where AI models have to resolve real GitHub issues from actual software repositories. Scores climbed from 60% to nearly 100% in a single year, Chris.
Wait, so you're telling me that AI models went from solving about 6 out of 10 real-world coding problems to essentially solving almost all of them in the span of just 12 months? Because that's an extraordinary rate of improvement by any standard.
That is exactly what the data shows. And it's not just coding either, because frontier models are now meeting or exceeding human baselines on PhD-level science questions, multimodal reasoning tasks, and competition-level mathematics, which are some of the hardest benchmarks we have.
And when we talk about frontier models here, we're talking about Claude Opus 4.6 from Anthropic sitting at the top of the ARENA benchmark with a score of 1,148 in its thinking configuration. And then you have models from China right on its heels, which brings us to what might be the biggest geopolitical story in the report.
The US-China AI gap has effectively closed, and I want people to really sit with that for a moment because this was supposed to be a comfortable strategic buffer that American policymakers were counting on, and according to Stanford's data, it has essentially evaporated over the past year.
Give us the specific numbers on that, because I think the details really matter here, and especially when you look at who is leading in which specific categories and how the competition has evolved since early 2025 when DeepSeek first made headlines.
So, as of March 2026, the top U.S. model leads the top Chinese model by just 2.7 percentage points on the ARENA benchmark. And that lead has been trading back and forth multiple times since early 2025, which means neither country has a sustained dominant position anymore in raw model performance.
And yet the picture is more nuanced than just a single benchmark number, right? Because the report breaks down competitiveness across several different dimensions, and the use in China each have areas where they're actually leading the other fairly decisively.
Absolutely. China now leads in publication volume, citations, total patent output, and industrial robot installations, while the United States still produces more top-tier AI models and generates higher impact patents, so it's really a story of different kinds of leadership across different dimensions of the ecosystem.
There's a talent dimension to this that I found really alarming, because the report says the number of AI researchers and developers moving to the United States has dropped 89% since 2017. With an 80% decline in just the last year alone.
That talent migration number should be setting off alarm bells in Washington because the U.S. has historically relied on attracting the world's best AI researchers. And if that pipeline dries up, the investment advantage starts to matter a lot less. Even with $285.9 billion in private AI investment in 2025.
Let's talk about that investment figure because a $285.9 billion is staggering. And it's more than 23 times the $12.4 billion that was invested in China. So the money flowing into American AI is still massively outpacing every other country on the planet right now.
And the U.S. had 1,953 newly funded AI companies in 2025, which is more than 10 times the next closest country. So the entrepreneurial energy is still overwhelmingly concentrated in America. But the question is whether money and startups alone can maintain technical leadership when the talent flow is reversing.
That's the strategic question that keeps coming up throughout this report. And I think it connects to the adoption numbers too. Because this isn't just about who's building the best models anymore, and it's about who's actually deploying them at scale in the real economy.
The adoption numbers are remarkable in their own right, with 88% of organizations now saying they're using AI in some capacity, and generative AI hitting 53% population level adoption within just 3 years, which the report notes is faster than either the personal computer or the internet achieved.
Faster than the internet, that's a stat that really puts into perspective how quickly this technology has moved from research labs into everyday tools that regular people are using. And 4 out of 5 university students are now using generative AI, according to the report as well.
The speed of adoption creates its own set of problems, though, and this is where the report gets really concerning because safety and transparency are not keeping pace with capability, and the numbers on that front paint a pretty alarming picture of where we actually stand.
Let's dig into the safety data because I know the report tracks documented AI incidents, and I've been hearing that the number jumped significantly. So walk us through what Stanford found on the responsible AI front and how it compares to previous years.
Documented AI incidents rose to 362 in 2025, up from 233 in 2024, which is a significant jump. And the foundation model Transparency Index, which measures how openly companies disclose details about training data, compute, risks, and policies, actually dropped from an average score of 58 to just 40 points.
So we have models getting dramatically more capable, adoption accelerating faster than any technology in history. And simultaneously, the companies building these systems are becoming less transparent about how they work, which seems like a genuinely dangerous combination when you think about it.
The report's authors put it quite bluntly, saying that responsible AI is not keeping pace with AI capability, with safety benchmarks lagging and incidents rising sharply. And I think that framing is important because it's not just activists saying this, it's Stanford researchers looking at the hard data.
And then there's the public trust dimension, which might be the most fascinating part of the entire report because you have this enormous gap between how AI experts view the technology and how regular people feel about it. And those two perspectives are really diverging.
The expert-public divide is a 50 percentage point gap on the question of AI's impact on jobs, with 73% of U.S. experts saying the impact will be positive, while only 23% of the general public agrees. And that disconnect has real implications for policy and regulation.
50 points is a massive gap, and it makes you wonder whether the experts are out of touch or the public is underinformed. Or maybe the truth is somewhere in between, because both groups are looking at the same technology, but drawing very different conclusions about what it means for their lives.
There is a bit of nuance in the optimism numbers, though, because 59% of people reported feeling optimistic about AI's benefits, which is actually up from 52% last year. But nervousness also ticked up to 52%, so people are simultaneously more hopeful and more anxious.
That's a really interesting psychological profile of where the public stands right now, feeling both excited about the potential and nervous about the risks. And I imagine the question of who regulates all of this plays into that anxiety quite a bit.
It does, and here's the number that should concern American policymakers the most. The United States ranks dead last among surveyed countries in public trust in its own government to regulate AI at just 31%, while the European Union enjoys significantly more public confidence on that front.
Dead last, that's a remarkable position for the country that is home to most of the world's leading AI companies. And it suggests a real legitimacy gap when it comes to governance, especially as the technology gets more powerful and more pervasive in daily life.
I think this connects to the broader regulatory landscape because the EU has the AI Act in effect. They have clear frameworks and enforcement mechanisms, while the US approach has been much more fragmented with executive orders and voluntary commitments, and the public seems to notice that difference.
Let's pivot to the environmental impact data, because the report included some numbers on training emissions and data center power consumption that really put the physical footprint of this technology into perspective, and I think people need to hear these figures.
The environmental numbers are eye-opening, with Grok 4's estimated training emissions reaching 72,816 tons of CO2 equivalent, which Stanford notes is roughly the same greenhouse gas emissions as driving 17,000 cars for an entire year just to train a single model one time.
And that's just one model from one company. So when you multiply that across all the frontier models being trained globally, the cumulative environmental impact becomes enormous. And then you add in the inference costs of actually running these models billions of times per day for users.
Exactly. And the data center side is equally staggering, with AI data center power capacity rising to 29.6 gigawatts, which the report says is about what it takes to power the entire state of New York at peak demand. And that capacity is still growing rapidly as demand continues to increase.
So we have this technology that's adopting faster than anything in history, closing geopolitical gaps, pushing past PhD-level human performance on hard problems, and simultaneously consuming enough electricity to power a major U.S. state, all while public trust in governance lags behind.
That tension is really the central narrative of the 2020 WASI Index, and I think what makes this year's report different from previous editions is that it's no longer just tracking progress, it's documenting the emergence of serious structural mismatches between capability, adoption, safety, and governance.
One thing I want to highlight is the private sector dominance finding, because the report notes that private companies built more than 9 out of 10 of the world's most powerful AI models in 2025, which means the direction of this technology is overwhelmingly being set by corporate priorities rather than public research institutions.
That concentration of power in the private sector is a theme that runs throughout the report, and it connects to the transparency decline because these are the same companies that are becoming less open about how their models work, even as those models become more capable and more widely deployed.
It also raises questions about the public interest dimension of AI development, because when the vast majority of frontier research is happening behind closed corporate doors, the ability of independent researchers, regulators, and the public to understand and shape this technology gets significantly more limited.
And circling back to the geopolitical competition, the combination of declining talent inflows, closing capability gaps, and massive private sector concentration creates a strategic landscape that looks very different from what most policymakers probably assumed even 2 years ago when the U.S. advantage seemed more secure.
I think the big takeaway from this report for our listeners is that 2026 is a year of convergence, where multiple trend lines are crossing in ways that create both incredible opportunities and genuine systemic risks that we haven't fully grappled with as a society yet.
Beautifully put, Chris, and I would add that the speed of everything documented in this report, the capability gains, the adoption curves, the closing international gaps, suggests that the window for getting governance and safety right is narrowing faster than most institutions are currently moving.
If there's one number from this report that should stick with our listeners today, I think it's the 89% decline in AI talent moving to the United States, because in a field where human expertise still drives innovation, losing that pipeline could reshape the competitive landscape more than any benchmark score.
I completely agree, and I would pair that with the transparency index dropping from 58 to 40, because when the most powerful technology in the world is being built by companies that are becoming less open about what they're doing, that's a combination that should concern everyone, regardless of where they fall on the optimism spectrum.
And for anyone who wants to dive deeper into the data, the full Stanford HAI Index 2026 report is freely available online. And it includes interactive charts and downloadable data sets that let you explore these trends across dozens of different dimensions and countries.
Definitely worth bookmarking. And I think the most important thing listeners can do with this information is use it to have more informed conversations about AI in their own organizations and communities. Because the decisions being made right now will shape how this technology affects all of us for decades to come.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast, where we broke down the biggest annual report card on the state of artificial intelligence. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.